Funding for this program is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the Friends of Minnesota Experience.
Born of the man-guided calculations of the super-electronic brains, entire new industries are flashing into being.
We had Silicon Valley here. We had 4 big computer companies when Silicon Valley was still making transistors.
Minnesota roots are very deep in this business, without question.
We are an innovative state. When you look back at the history, I think we're really bad at telling our story.
Technology is one of those tools that can allow us to solve problems at scale.
That set of skills and people and networks is just as vital for Minnesota's high-tech future as it's been for its high-tech past. How's that for a tagline?
That's great.
Well, the computing industry came here to Minnesota something by an accident, and the accident started in Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When there was a failure of code reading and code breaking that led to the famous catastrophe in Pearl Harbor. As a response to that, both the Navy and the Army ended up making their own code breaking units. And there was a very important effort that was done in Dayton, Ohio by the National Cash Register Company. They built machines essentially that were models of the German and Japanese code machines. That effort was also transferred to Washington, where people that were involved with the Minnesota industry, including Bill Norris, were involved with something called CSAW, C-S-A-W, Communications Supplementary Activity Washington. It has a Navy code name. But that was a very important code-breaking enterprise. Now, at the end of the war, nobody wanted to touch code breaking. It was a super secret activity. It was one of the most secret activities that the US had, the atomic bomb. It was right up in that alley. So what they ended up doing was looking around for some industrial firm to take this up. National Cash Register in Dayton, Ohio didn't want to do this. IBM didn't want it. Eastman Kodak didn't want it. And so the Navy was stuck with the need for taking this group of people. There were about 3,000 people that worked in Washington, in Nebraska Avenue. Later, the Department of Homeland Security was there. And a group ended up getting the Navy essentially to find a local businessman here, John Parker, to take over this effort. Parker was somebody who could run factories and could run big industrial organizations. He was well plugged into the Washington political scene, which was important, but also well plugged into the financial scene here. And he didn't know anything about code breaking, didn't know anything about computing. It was all top secret, but out of a sense of patriotism, he would do that. During the war, he'd run a factory for making wooden gliders, and that's the same factory that exists today.
It had been Northwest Aeronautical during World War II, building gliders. And of course, the minute the war ended, they shut that all down. They had the facility here. The man that ran the company, John Parker, and owned the company, was looking for something to put in here.
That's where the Engineering Research Associates was organized, and that's where its first factory was. You can see that factory today.
I had graduated from college in engineering in '43, but then went right into service. When I got out of the service, a friend of mine and I came up here looking for work. There weren't a lot of companies looking for engineers. Somebody said, well, go over to the state employment office. They might have some leads. And they said, well, the only thing we have is there's a new company in St. Paul, over in the Midway, that's only 6 months old. They're hiring engineers and they're doing government work, and they won't tell anybody what they're doing. We both went to work for them. I stayed with them for 30 years. There were windows overhead that some of them were broken or open, and the birds would get in, and you'd come in the morning and you'd find a fresh deposit on your desk, so you didn't leave any important papers or anything out at night.
It happened to fall to the Twin Cities by this accident. Nobody else wanted code breaks. But it's really important to understand that the Twin Cities at that time was a very rich and fertile ground for mechanical industry and for electromechanical industry. There were thousands and thousands of skilled workers. Honeywell was here with its big factories doing high precision manufacturing in downtown Minneapolis. St. Paul was the site where the trolley factory had been. The Snelling Shops was a very important site. During the 50s, the trolley industry was winding down, the computer industry was winding up. So although it may have been an accident in some ways that ERA came to St. Paul, it landed in very fertile ground. Frank Mulaney gave an interview where he said, "We learned during the war with radar how to move pulses and open gates and have the flow of pulses go through. This was all to process radar signals, and that was an extremely useful skill to transfer over because computers don't have continuous waves, they have pulses. That's the digital ones and zeros. So many electrical engineers learned how to do pulse circuits, including Frank Mulaney and Jack Hill, and those were two ERA people that were absolutely crucial.
Bill Norris was really a remarkable manager. He could spot people who could solve problems in new ways.
People were inventing conceptually what a computer was, but they also needed to invent the hardware. And so Goldberg and Demon are an important connection between that wartime cryptography and the world of fully programmable digital computers. So these two machines were not programmable, but they had many of the same technical components. They had a way of storing data.
All of these computers needed memory. They needed some place to put stuff and then look it up later on. And they wanted it fast, but there wasn't anything existing. They tried using paper tape, like teletype tape. It was a form of memory. That would work, but it was way too slow. They tried using magnetic tape. That worked, but it, again, was slow because what you wanted maybe was on the end of the reel. And you had to go all the way through the reel to get to what we were looking for. So that wasn't very acceptable. In our group here, one of the brains had the idea of taking magnetic tape and pasting it around the periphery of a drum. And you put magnetic recording heads that were close but not touching, and then record onto that tape. And of course, one revolution and you were all the way around. You were so it was very fast. And they started out by doing it with tape, but they couldn't get the tape to stay on the drum. It kept flying off because they were running this drum at, 1,800 RPM revolutions per minute.
It was spinning apparently at 60 miles an hour, and you could read individual bits at 60 miles an hour.
Then they finally got smart and went to 3M and asked to buy the liquid material that they coated tape with. And instead of putting it on the tape, they sprayed it with a airbrush type of gun onto the surface of the drum. We built this drum for Goldberg, and again, we stole one of the Goldberg drums and put it on Demon 1. The prototype for that drum is over here at the Minnesota History Center right now, and I worked on that.
Demon worked perfectly for 4 months. The Soviets, that was our principal challenge and enemy during the Cold War years, of course, they ended up changing their code, and the huge investment in building Demon essentially was junked. It was a special purpose machine. So one of the people involved with what became the National Security Agency, James Pendergrass, said, well, when the code changes, you have to get rid of the hardware. If you did that all in, they didn't have the term software, but a program. Well, if the Soviets changed their code, then you could change the software. So he ended up essentially writing a contract to ERA to do a study for a general purpose computer, and that became the famous Task 13 that evolved into the ERA 1101. By the fall of 1950, the machine was not only reliable enough to move from the factory, but it was in fact moved 1,000 miles by rail to Washington, D.C., uncrated, set up In 2 weeks it was running and it was stable. Other computers that were moved at the time were very fragile. There's another machine, Binac, that got moved from the East Coast to California and it died somewhere in the process. It never worked once it got to California. But this ERA machine was quite notable. It was very fast. It was about $1 million, but it had full programmability. ERA didn't start out building computers. They started out building what they could get contracts for.
They were doing almost anything they could do to make money, so they had a lot of odds and end projects.
The contract that took off, though, and that gave them a financial base was antenna couplers. And antenna couplers turned out to be one of those small little pieces that were absolutely essential for the new era of jet aircraft.
The metal antenna is not necessarily specifically tuned to the radio frequency that you're trying to communicate with. And so what you do is you insert electronics between the antenna and the transceiver in order to tune the antenna. There were thousands and thousands of those made because they went into 707s, KC-135s. We had a special version that went aboard the B-58 Hustler. Some of the early ones were aboard the presidential aircraft, so they would have communications whenever they flew overseas.
And these things were done with a super high degree of reliability and precision, exactly the types of skills and the types of engineering, the types of design that ERA and later UNIVAC and Control Data also used in making computers. The 50s are kind of an interesting time. ERA, remember, was organized to be a research shop. They were getting into manufacturing, but they didn't have the finances for doing so. So John Parker was essentially looking for an out.
Remington Rand was interested in buying the company. They had bought several other small electronic companies in the computer business. So in '52, they bought out ERA.
And there's a kind of battle between the Philadelphia-based engineers that had the inside power within the company and the St. Paul people that felt that they were sort of on the outside.
Philadelphia was building UNIVACs. They're the ones that coined the term UNIVAC, Universal Automatic Computer. They decided that was a good name, UNIVAC.
So even their division, it was the UNIVAC division of Remington Rand and UNIVAC division of Sperry Rand after the Sperry company merges into that in 1955. Bill Norris was in the middle of that tension. He was a vice president at the time and involved with manufacturing and trying to organize this. He had company-wide responsibilities. He was no longer solely in St. Paul. And so he was really at the highest levels of the company and constantly fighting reorganization battles. But by 1957, he was basically demoted, and he was furious and upset about that. Norris ended up leaving UNIVAC in July 1957. A group of business people, not Norris himself, created something called the Control Data Corporation. They chose that name because they were looking for investor sizzle words. They were hoping to get a hold of some of the very talented engineers like Frank Mullaney and others from UNIVAC. They were hoping to get a hold of Norris, but they created this company in advance of that. Norris doesn't come to work for them until about 5 weeks later. Seymour Cray, maybe the most famous of the engineers, it wasn't until December he was finishing up another project for UNIVAC. Control Data, it's a startup. They're pitching for government contracts. They're doing all kinds of things. They're hoping to get some sort of business.
Not only was Control Data new, but it was just getting started and trying to tap into the market.
They have no contracts and they're running out of money.
People didn't even know what the computer industry was. And certainly they didn't know what Control Data was.
And then finally they end up getting an Air Force contract, a Navy contract, a few things that kind of come in the 1958, 59. By the 1960 or so, the company is well positioned. The origins of Honeywell as a computer manufacturer stretch way, way, way back to the late 19th century. There were two different firms, one in Indiana and one here, that were involved with stoves. Coal stoves needed to have their air adjusted. So Honeywell, and the firm that was in the Twin Cities, figured out a way essentially of making an on-off switch that would be temperature regulated, what we would call a thermostat. Now, in the 1920s, those two firms were combined and became something of a force for control systems. During the Second World War, like many companies, Honeywell was very heavily involved in the military economy. So they worked on things like the Norden bomb sight. It was kind of an analog computer. And in the 1950s, ended up moving more firmly into the military market on top of its market in heating controls. They started up joint ventures with people in the Massachusetts area and tried to figure out ways of building big room-sized computers. UNIVAC, control data, Honeywell, and then the fourth part of the Minnesota story, of course, is IBM Rochester. That gets off the ground in the late 50s. IBM chose Rochester after a nationwide competition. It was a place where IBM felt that it could move and buy a big tract of land, build a new factory. It's possible to think of IBM Rochester simply as a kind of factory outpost, but it was so much more than that. And I think an early signal that at least IBM was hoping for something really big is the factory design. When they ended up building IBM Rochester, it didn't look like a factory, it looked like a spaceship. You can see it today. The modern architect who did that design chose colors very carefully and chose the design very carefully to make a statement. This was a showpiece for the company. Maybe that was a hint that this was more than a factory.
I was learning about engineering at MIT. Came home for the summer. I was looking for a summer job, and my dad said, "Why don't you call your old scoutmaster, George Hansen? He got involved with this new company, and he might be able to use you for the summer." I said, "Great." So I called him. Turned out it was Control Data. And so I worked that summer in 1959 at Control Data, and I helped assemble a computer called the 1604, which was designed by this fellow Seymour Cray.
The very first 1604 was delivered at the Naval Postgraduate School in California.
And they gained credibility in part because of that.
Because of the success of the 1604, Control Data quickly was known around the world in all the laboratories and scientific research institutes and so forth. It was, as a matter of fact, labeled by one of the Twin Cities papers as a supercomputer, which was the first time I can recall that term being used.
We militarized the Control Data 1604 computer, which went into the Polaris submarines and did the calculations for the missile system.
Cray was involved with 1604, and then Cray was also involved with the 6600, which was really the machine that everybody recognizes as setting Control Data over the top. This was one of the early supercomputers. They were going to sell it for about $5 million. If we could sell 10 of the 6600s, then we would cover our costs. Instead of selling 10, they sold 100. And in the public mind, from that point in time onward, Control Data was the supercomputer company. In 1969, it has revenues, not profits, but revenues of $1 billion a year, and its stock goes through the roof. Supercomputing was a component. It was what made Control Data famous, but it wasn't the kind of cash cow that provided steady, reliable revenues coming in.
At that point in time, if you wanted to buy peripheral equipment that were really any good, you could only get them from IBM. But IBM had no OEM policy, if you will. You bought them retail, period. Since they represent half the cost of a computer, that's a pretty tough way to make money.
Vertical integration was almost essential in the beginning for Control Data because there really wasn't an industry like the way we see computers today. If you wanted high-performance storage, you had to make it.
Bob Perkins was a guy in Control Data who came up with the idea of selling our disk drives to other computer manufacturers.
They acquired a small company, Cedar Engineering, and turned it into a standalone business.
And the peripherals business ultimately became a multi-million-dollar business on its own.
They decided to also invest in the development of the key components, the recording heads and the media. Being able to do that, you can control your own destiny. The first model, that was in the early 60s, was 300 megabytes. And the one I worked on, we got it up to 700 megabytes.
These were huge, complicated hydraulic machines in the beginning. They kept getting smaller and smaller.
If you fast forward from where we were there until the latest products that you see in the 3.5-inch size, we've increased the recording density 10 million times. That's huge.
The cost of storing data dropped by a factor of 20 million. Well, we led the world in this technology in the end, putting more data at lower cost than anybody else did.
Control Data was an unusual firm, in part because of Bill Norris. It had an unusual social vision.
He didn't believe in philanthropy. He believed in work and getting paid for work.
The 1960s was a very tumultuous time. The riots in other places were the ones that were famous, but there were riots here in Minneapolis as well on the north side. There was a small African-American community that was quite isolated from the rest of the city. After the assassination, so Bill Norris says we have to engage this urban problem. This is the most important problem that Control Data faces. But he ended up putting in 2 factories, with Selby Bindery in St. Paul, and the other was the North Side factory in Minneapolis.
The world was going to run out of talented computer people. We needed to develop new sources of talented people, and by cultivating the minority communities and women into the company was very simply the idea that this was a way to tap into human resources that we would ultimately need. And it was absolutely right on. The inner city plants were certainly tough sells internally.
We've never had social projects. What we actually are doing is addressing unmet societal needs as business opportunities. And that's an absolutely sound business strategy.
UNIVAC had a very storied career with missile guidance, naval tactical data, and air traffic control.
During that time, there began the big arms race between Russia and the United States. I did get into a group that was developing a Athena computer that could be used to guide intercontinental ballistic missiles. What I was in charge of was integrating the radar with the computer. To do this, I had to write these programs manually. NASA came to us, but we ended up converting the computer programs to put satellites into orbit. First one was called Tyros, and it was a weather satellite. Following Tyros, there was a 9-arm balloon that was made by the Sheldon Company in Minnesota. It was injected into orbit. It would be about 100-foot diameter balloon, and this was used for passive communications to test out systems. 1962 on, the Athena computer was used to help NASA put over 40 different satellites into space.
My work was mainly in getting things produced that would get out into the military world and work well. NTDS was the Naval Tactical Data System.
The combat system on the ship, all the weapons are the reason the ship is out there, and everything else is kind of built to support that. The combat system had to be super reliable, had to be super rugged, and it had to function all the time.
From there, I went into the submarine world for the CNC, the Central Navigation Computer for the Poseidon missile program. The submarine had to cruise to a designated spot that was surveyed in to do the launch. The memory processor would allow the submarine to launch from any place in this Earth. And all of a sudden, all those spots that were surveyed in and probably known by the Soviets no longer were valid. And that was one of the things that contributed to the end of the Cold War.
We had a contract with the Air Force to build the Minuteman launch control computers. We built that in the 1960s. They're still running. The biggest threat to it today is that the data comes on 8-inch floppies, and you can't buy 8-inch floppies much anymore.
I started out in software testing on the DDG 993 program, which was a surface ship being built for the Iranian Navy. And then when the Shah was kicked out in 1979, the ships actually were used for a number of years by the United States Navy then.
Got it back on the B-2 program before it came out of the black world. So I did an advanced mission computer for the F-16 program. I retired after doing the F-35.
In the military business, they were willing to try new things and pay for the research and development and stuff. And in the early days, I think that spawned some of the technologies that found their way into the commercial world.
I started as a component engineer doing evaluation of semiconductors. They were just coming out. The specifications that the industry was giving us was one page with a few pieces of information. And during the 25 years I was at UNIVAC, that spec became 500 pages, and the device was so super complex.
Well, the first air traffic control system went aboard a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. It was a UNIVAC computer with radar returns that would automatically land aircraft on aircraft carriers, particularly valuable in bad weather. Most people don't know that, but that evolved into basically air traffic control on the commercial side for the FAA.
That was the mainstay of all the air traffic control terminals in the United States for 40 years. They just retired the last one maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It was a tremendously collegial place.
I started in 1956. I was the first female director at UNIVAC. Benefits, job I really liked it. It was a good place to work, I thought.
One time we were up to 10,000 people. We were the second largest, I think only second to 3M in the Twin Cities.
I started out in the Midway area, and then I was at Shepherd Road for a while, and then ended up in Eagan. We had a plant in Roseville, too. Our home office was in Pennsylvania, and I was there for about 5 years, I think, too. And then I said, I want to come home, because Minnesota is the place to be. I love it here.
Cray is a hero. Cray's machines were designed with a kind of elegance, and they were super fast and quite reliable. Cray 1 and Cray 2 were both phenomenally successful machines.
The first computer we sold was actually to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. It cost $8 million. All the money the company had spent from the beginning of time to then was $8 million.
The reason for that iconic shape of the Cray 1 and later on the Cray 2 goes back to cooling. So the inner part sort of looks like a bit of a tower. Well, that's actually the planes where the circuitry is, and that kind of love seat area was where a cooling fluid was being circulated. You think, well, they just put the love seat there because it was a friendly place to go. No, it must have been warm, so it was a kind of cozy place to sit, I guess.
At the time, the market for our computers was very limited. It was 86 potential customers in the whole world, mostly government laboratories. And there would be maybe 10 computers a year that would be sold to those 86 customers. We had it worked out that if we could sell 4 a year, we'd be in Fat City. In the late 70s and the early 80s, our computers were used to do scientific research by simulating physical experiments. To do that takes an extraordinary amount of computer power, and commercial companies started to see advantages to doing this. The first ones were the car companies, because they would do crashes, right? You crash the car against the wall and see what happens to the dummies, and also what happens to the car itself. We were able to simulate that and do it more accurately and with more information than you could get by doing it physically. So the commercial market opened up for us, and that's when Cray Research became really famous.
We altered the way cars are made. Every car company except Volvo, in 2-3 years, was a Cray customer.
Shortly after I got to Cray, I felt like, oh my God, I've found my tribe. Everybody was so smart. You felt like you were making a difference because it was an inspiring place to work.
The Rochester people developed a set of mini computers, they call them mid-range computers, culminating in the 80s with the AS400.
All Rochester series of systems had to have high quality. The system had to work. The customer was used to running his business with that system. When we got to about the AS400, I think we sold about 800,000 of those systems around the world.
They sold for tens of thousands of dollars up to about $1 million. And at one point in time, IBM Rochester has revenues in 1 year of $14 billion.
We built an operating system that had database, communications, transaction processing, everything you need in a computer system in one place integrated.
So when they delivered a package, it was really a full package, and people in Rochester, I think, took satisfaction in being able to create a computer line that was widely sold, widely popular, and supremely profitable for the company as a whole.
They won the Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award for the Rochester site in 1990. Well, that was a very significant accomplishment and a recognition of the work that we did in Rochester.
University High School was a subset of the University of Minnesota. It was the training school, if you will, for teachers. We just knew we were going to have an opportunity to get kids involved with this whole thing called the computer. Little did we know what we were starting. Time-sharing machine was a teletypewriter with an acoustic coupler that dialed up the telephone, and then you were online and you could communicate. There were literally hundreds of people using the same computer, but the computer is so fast. And so the school became a market. Wilmer and 14 Twin Cities school districts said, let's form an organization to provide computer services. That was called TIES, T-I-E-S, Total Information Education Services.
The first of the time-sharing systems that had gotten out there from TIES, there was one of these old teletype 33s with the paper tape reader and the printer that prints on a roll of paper, and a manual about how to program in BASIC. So that's what got me started in computers. They didn't realize just how much time some junior high kids could burn on the time-sharing system until they saw the bill, and then they kind of reined us in a little bit.
The Twin Cities, I get everything. So we better take care of this problem. We're going to make a statewide TIES.
The Minnesota Education Computing Consortium, commissioned by Governor Anderson, he used to say, if it's good for the kids in Edina, it's good for the kids in Black Duck.
So all of Minnesota got hooked into the giant computer that we put over in Lauderdale. We also then started building software for the kids. And along came this young guy by the name of Don Rawitsch. One of the things that Don Rawitsch brought along was a mental model of something called Oregon Trail. He had it on 100 miles of paper tape. Then microcomputers started popping up. There were microcomputers by Radio Shack, TRS-80s, and there were all kinds of different models.
MEC did an analysis of what PCs would be best. Apple came out the winner. And of course, the rest is history, because we had developed a lot of software on the time sharing. We were able to then translate that software to PC-based software. Apple then, in cooperation with us, had the ability to license our software anywhere they want to use it in return for a discounted price on the Apple II at that time.
All of a sudden, people in other states started buying Apple computers. And guess what? Oregon Trail became famous. And guess what? Dozens of other products became famous. And so we then set up a distribution in schools only. So that's how all of a sudden Oregon Trail and all its buddies were all over the country.
I spent my 6th grade year playing Oregon Trail. I loved playing Oregon Trail. I mean, if allowed by my parents, I probably would have been an early gamer or something because I just loved doing that, but that was not going to be tolerated on the dairy farm.
The University of Minnesota has a very important role to play in the high-tech economy and the computing industry itself. The 1943 class for electrical engineers, like 2/5 of them ended up working for ERA. It was just like a pipeline.
The University of Minnesota was good at turning out first engineers and then computer scientists.
I came to graduate school at some place called the University of Minnesota.
I finished up my college at the university.
The University of Minnesota.
The University of Minnesota.
The University of Minnesota.
To the University of Minnesota.
Graduate school at the university.
University of Minnesota.
The University of Minnesota.
I came from India, my MBA at the university. My roommate, and he's a very good friend of mine, Dale Weeks.
After high school, I came to university for a year, blew my scholarship.
The university was also into big computers.
And in a lot of ways, Control Data and then Cray built the University Computer Center. The computer center was able to generate quite a bit of revenue by charging for compute cycles on the big machines, and it had to because it had to buy or lease those things. A consultant that was one of the really smart guys that knew what was coming was preaching that there was this internet thing that was going to be really important where computers from different research institutions can ship files back and forth. That got the wheels turning because then we could see that there was more to it than just modems dialing up to the mainframe. It was international connectivity.
They had something known as Internet Gopher. This was in the early 1990s. It was literally the World Wide Web before the World Wide Web.
Finding resources on the internet was a problem, and one that was first tackled in 1991 by a group of students at the University of Minnesota.
There's the idea, loose in the world among higher ed, that you need to have a campus-wide information system, some kind of shared bulletin board or place where information pertinent to the university community would show up and people could get to. So with those ideas, simple, easy to build, had a full-text search engine, didn't matter that much where you started, and people could have their own arrangements and organizations imposed on the data that lived across all the servers, we were pretty sure we had a good thing. And then the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA, sent an email saying, hey, you guys are using port 4170, and that was not a port assigned to you. That led to us writing up some documentation, led to us getting invited out to an Internet Engineering Task Force meeting, which is where the big gods of the Internet get together. At about the same time, Tim Berners-Lee, over in Europe, is doing his World Wide Web thing and gets a very similar notice saying, hey, you need to get your act together. And Tim was invited out to the same Internet Engineering Task Force meeting that we went out to talk about our stuff. A really low-numbered port means you got in there early. Gopher got assigned the official port 70. World Wide Web is at port 80. We got there first.
It's not that it could have changed the world. It did change the world. It was the web for these 4 years or so prior to the Mosaic browser.
In, I think it was 1986, within this area, there were like 12,000 Sperry employees. That was the peak and things kind of have dwindled since then.
In like 1987, with Perestroika, with the declining defense budgets, what are we going to do? There aren't going to be as many ships being built, there aren't going to be many airplanes. We're doing defense work. What's going to happen to our jobs? We got bought out, for instance, by Burroughs. They walk in on a Monday morning and they take a whole bunch of the engineers in Plant 1 and walk them out the door. And so every time you get bought out, this is going to happen.
Now, one had already been laid off.
I worked there 47 years and I survived 46 layoffs.
Really, we were two separate companies by that time. The defense people were focused on defense, and the commercial people were out trying to sell to businesses. And the commercial side is still owned by Unisys, and they still have a couple of facilities here. The defense side went through a progression of things. Burroughs, and then the defense operations were bought by a company called Loral, and then Loral was bought by Lockheed Martin. They finally made the decision to close the Eagan facility in 2012. Now there's probably, from those equivalent companies, there's probably 500 or 600 left in the Twin Cities.
The FAA, all of our air traffic control computers came out of our engineering shop. And we're still in that business, by the way. In fact, when Lockheed Martin closed the plant here, the agency basically forced them to keep the air traffic control part of it going.
A successor to UNIVAC, Lockheed Martin's company's called Lighthouse now, still doing air traffic control, not always using Unisys computers as other computers, but it's the systems work. And that's an example of what I think was different about the company here than the traditional computer company.
In 1979, Millie was in the human resources group at Sperry, and she noted that a lot of people, when they were retiring, really didn't quite want to let go.
So many of the employees were reluctant to leave and wanted to continue to see each other. So I just one day called some of them up and said, should we start a VIP club? And they were very enthused about it.
Volunteerism is a big part of it. They used to go to Channel 2 fundraisers and they would take phone calls. At one time, we had about 1,400 members, but because of diminishing number of retirees and companies and so forth, we're now at about 160. Our size is diminishing, but we continue to have a lot of these get-togethers. It's a lot of people, with their friendship, continuing outside of the workspace. In 2005, Lockheed was starting to develop documentation of the Lockheed 100-year celebration, and they in turn asked their sub-companies, hey, what's your history? Could the retirees help? We started collecting artifacts, printed circuit cards, computers and everything, and they were in people's basement, garages and so forth, and then through a little arm twisting, Lockheed Martin said, okay, we'll set up some office space and what have you. So we had a couple of office spaces there.
As people started leaving the company, probably because they were getting laid off, bring by more stuff. So there's more and more. And when the photo lab shut down, got file cabinet after file cabinet of photos and transparencies. And as the training department shut down, got, again, multiple file cabinets of documents and training information. I mean, thousands of documents.
When Lockheed Martin announced that they were going to close, what are we going to do with all of these artifacts and books and so forth? What do we do? So we ended up with two-dimensional items being donated to Babbage Institute, the three-dimensional stuff to the Lachey Memorial Museum in South St. Paul.
I think it was December of 2012. There were 2 semis, and there were something like 20 pallets of documents, photos, equipment, computers.
And I don't think they had any idea how much it was going to be, what it would be.
I don't believe there's any larger collection of UNIVAC computers anywhere in the world other than maybe the Smithsonian and the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. So for a small county museum, there's a collection of equipment there that doesn't exist anywhere else. Harvey Typala and myself got another grant to take it to the next step and actually catalog this. It included a scanning station. There are probably 20,000 plus 35 millimeter slides. We're continuing to do that. We've been doing that now for 5 years, and I don't know when the end is. It's going to be several more years.
We go every other week, a group of us, and every other week another group go, and we just sit there and we go through pictures and we key it into a database.
It's a labor of love for those doing it.
And the biggest questions in any company is defining your business. In control data's case, they also didn't answer the question well.
We used to complain that the only thing bad about control data was at times they didn't seem to know what business they were in.
It was a difficult time for American industry. The 1980s is the classic area of deindustrialization.
Trying to do all these new things was always expensive. The world kind of caught up with control data in the 80s. Like the kid in the candy store, we had more opportunities than we had money.
Probably I knew in 1983 or 84 that control data was facing issues.
We had decided already by the 80s that the major thrust of the company would be in computer services, not in hardware. The company had a succession of problems. Its old standby mainframe computers was not nearly the cash cow that it had once been. And the supercomputers were facing additional competition from Seymour Cray's new company. There was new and really tough competition in that old standby, the OEM disk drive business.
For the first time, there are many, many different industries, and computing industry is one of them, that are getting fabulous competition from Japan.
It was the financial resources that were straining the company, and there was a lot of pressure at the top of the company to do something about that.
Today, I'm announcing my decision to retire as Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Control Data, effective immediately. I informed the board.
I think he felt that he had brought the company to a solid foundation, and it was up to other people, me and others, to take it on.
Minnesota was not alone in missing the profound changes involved with the personal computing industry and then the shift to software.
They said, oh, you're going to have a computer on your desk. That'll never happen. That will never happen. Well, the market speaks in, whether you're willing to, listen.
As events unfolded in the late 80s and early 90s, it turned out to be a bigger challenge than we actually could achieve. The spin-offs, the legacy, is a flowing tribute to the work that we did for 30 or 40 years.
I was at Control Data for 22 years. I was ultimately in the disk drive operation, and that was sold to Seagate Technology in 1989.
That was just a very good merger because we had the high performance capability, we had the head in disk technology. It was kind of the onset of the desktop computing. They knew how to build disk drives for those kind of applications. And the other thing that was big, they knew how to manufacture and take cost out of it.
Seagate knew exactly what business they were in. And they were very visionary about where the market was heading. Alan Shugart, the guy who founded Seagate, had an amazing ability to, at the peak of success, say, no, the market's going over here, there, somewhere. And he was right all the time. And he saw personal computers as the market. You didn't need thousands of these. You needed hundreds of millions of these. $100,000 storage unit? No. It's got to be like a $75 storage unit with much more capacity. And that's what we did. And oh my, did it go.
Over our first 40 years, we produced a few billion disk drives, and those drives could store a few zettabytes of data. And a zettabyte is 1 followed by 21 zeros worth of data. It's a huge amount of data, but it kind of pales in comparison with what's happening over the next 5 to 10 years, where we're expecting to see a 10x increase over the next 5 to 10 years compared with what happened in the last 40 years.
All the pictures that we're taking, films, all your MRI scans, all those things, everything gets stored somewhere.
Massive centralized storage and compute data centers that provide services to this increasingly mobile world. You can't really see any signs that there's any technology at all inside a disk drive, and it's one of the most carefully machined and precise instruments you're going to find. We're tracking and we're controlling spacing and materials in the interface at the atomic scale.
Right now, Seagate is working on getting the next generation recording technology out, and that's called HAMR. Heat-assisted magnetic recording, where you take materials which really want to point in one particular direction, then you heat it so it becomes soft, and then you quickly write on it and then let the heat dissipate and cool down. And that way you can cram a whole lot into a very small space.
What we now see firms and organizations spending on technology, their use of technology, the ability for people to access that technology in almost everything they do.
If you are a company in 2019, you are a technology company in some way.
Well, tech companies, generally speaking, have a low barrier to entry. Software is a very malleable tool. It doesn't take a whole lot to get trained into some of the specific technologies, and so you can build businesses much faster than you can build a bricks and mortar business.
The problem solving actually leads first, followed by what is that tech solution that can be brought into the equation.
The civic tech movement is basically centered around engaging our citizens and residents here, helping improve the services that the government offers to us residents. How do you use technology to solve some of our challenges or to deliver better services to our residents? I'm one of the co-founders of Blackson Technology. We started that in 2015.
Using business as a force for good in the world. Just got back from Peru doing some work with coffee farmers, trying to help them get paid fairly for the green coffee beans that they're bringing into their plants.
What's amazing about our tech ecosystem is that we have both the big and the small. When you think about Target or even United Healthcare, these are technology companies. And then you have fledgling startups like Recovery that are just coming on the scene. And I think the talent pool that we have here is pretty incredible. There's so many things to plug into. It's just finding your community and getting engaged. What's really unique about Minnesota is that this is not about, creating the next widget or the big consumer play. This is about solving real problems that are affecting a lot of people.
What Minnesota offers is that desire to just jump in. Here's a problem, and here is our unique take on solving that problem.
There's a workforce here today that's really attractive. Not just the Twin Cities, but if you go out to Rochester, you go up to Duluth, St. Cloud, it's fairly pervasive throughout most of the state.
We maybe didn't as early recognize how strong that cluster of technology-based companies and ideas were to us. Now we do. And that's another undertold story of the state that you don't always get to hear about.
A variety of different industries, agriculture, finance, biomed, materials science, and that has created a pretty vibrant culture of innovation in the state. It provides really good access to an environment of talented, creative people, as well as a pretty rich ecosystem of business.
The opportunities today are even more exciting and more interesting for our younger generation.
I think our value around education is really a cornerstone to all of this.
And I am very, very impressed with the STEM initiatives and all that's going on.
Whether it's, addiction treatment services, computer technology, medical devices, agriculture. I mean, we are really, again, at this unique place where it's about solving problems.
That set of skills and people and networks is just as vital for Minnesota's high-tech future as it's been for its high-tech past.
Solid State, Minnesota's High-Tech History, is a TPT Partnerships co-production with the Minnesota High-Tech Association. Additional funding has been provided by Seagate Technology and the Real Institute.
Funding for this program is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the Friends of Minnesota Experience.